Westmoreland Chapel, Sunday, November
Something
3rd,
went wrong with the original tape that we made. I'm having to make this one over again. This is Luke 22, beginning with verse 35 and going through the end of the chapter to verse 71. Verse 35 says, He said to them, When I sent you without money, bag, sack, and sandals, did you lack anything? So they said, Nothing. Then he said to them, But now he who has a money bag, let him take it, and likewise a sack, and he who has no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. For I say to you that this which is written must still be accomplished in me. And he was numbered with the transgressors. For the things concerning me have an end. Then they said, Lord, look, here are 2 swords. And he said to them, It is enough. Now this is quite a mysterious passage, I think, because certainly the Lord is not talking about them arming themselves and getting ready to fight or even to defend the Lord and themselves, because we have positive indication of that right here in this same chapter. Because a little bit later, when Peter started swinging the sword, the Lord stopped him and healed the man that he hurt with the sword. So certainly explanation is not found in him wanting to have them fight. But we can, out of this passage, see a very important thing. He says that this which is written must still be accomplished in me. He was numbered with the transgressors. And certainly that's an important principle in this passage, that the Lord was numbered with the transgressors because he was taking our place. We, being transgressors, he had to become numbered with us in order to take the punishment of our sin upon himself. And then this sentence of his, for the things concerning me have an end. That's a marvelous statement. The things concerning me have an end, or have a purpose. How much concerning us has no purpose? It doesn't get anywhere. It doesn't have a eternal purpose. But things concerning him all had a purpose. He was the one man who ever lived who did nothing which didn't have an eternal purpose connected to it. What a man, what a life. So purposeful, so useful, so much accomplished by his life, because there was no waste, nothing going down the drain. And certainly that can't be said of anybody else's life by any means. Then we come to the prayer in the garden. And we're really on holy ground here. We need to take off our shoes as we enter into the garden and see the agony of the Lord Jesus as he faces the cross, knowing how deeply he was going to have to suffer. And coming out, he went to the Mount of Olives as he was accustomed, and his disciples also followed him. When he came to the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And he was withdrawn from them about a stone's throw. And he knelt down and prayed, saying, "Father, if it is your will, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." Then an angel appeared to him from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. And his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. When he rose up from prayer and had come to his disciples, he found them sleeping from sorrow. Then he said to them, "Why do you sleep? Rise and pray, lest you enter into temptation." And this matter of entering into temptation is an important one for us to see, because we see that the disciples missed out on something that would have meant a great deal to them, and that is that they might have been a help to the Lord in this hour of his trial. But they entered into the temptation of just turning aside from this, entering into something of his agony. Surely this speaks of a level of prayer that few people know much about. We read about men like David Brainerd, who, while he was in prayer, labored so earnestly and with such agony that his whole body would be covered with sweat when he got through. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't know anything about such entering into the Spirit's mighty prayer through these human vessels of ours. And certainly it doesn't, the opportunity for such prayer doesn't come very often in our lives, and the apostles had an opportunity not offered to anybody else, that they could have been a blessing to the Lord in his terrible hour of trial. And the only way that they could have entered into that was to enter into prayer at that time. And he says, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And we see something that's certainly a matter of experience with most of us, and that is that instead of entering into prayer, they entered into sleep. And it's so easy for us to do that when we have matters of prayer before us, and we ought to enter into prayer, and instead we go to sleep. And look at what a agony of prayer he entered into at that time. Being in agony, it says, he prayed more earnestly. and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. My. It's no wonder he had to have an angel come and strengthen him. He wouldn't have been able to survive after the beating he took. And of course the beating came later, but this weakened him terribly, to be sweating great drops of blood. He wouldn't have been able to live through the rest of this suffering he was going to have to face that very night and following day. But when he returned, he found the disciples sleeping from sorrow. They did manage to see in him the depth of his agony, and they were extremely sorrowful, undoubtedly, about it. But it's hard to stay up all night. And their bodies were crying out for sleep, and so they gave themselves to it. And he exclaimed to them, "Why do you sleep? Rise and pray, lest you enter into temptation." Then the next passage, verse 47, says, "And while he was still speaking, behold, a multitude, and he who was called Judas, one of the 12, went before them, and drew near to Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" When those around him saw what was going to happen, they said to him, "Lord, shall we strike with the sword?" And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus answered and said, "Permit even this." And he touched his ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and captains of the temple and the elders who had come to him, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you daily in the temple, you did not try to seize me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness." That's a terrible statement there. This is your hour and the power of darkness. The protection of heaven was going to be completely taken off of him, and he was left to be treated as the powers of darkness would have and did treat him. And this is a striking scene here of Judas coming up and kissing the Lord. And the Lord saying to him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" You know, I think even though the Lord knew Judas's heart and what would happen to him, and had known it from the beginning, still he treated Judas so beautifully, I think. I think there's indication here that he was still wanting to win Judas, and still hated to see him go the way he was going, and was in a sense, heartbroken that Judas would betray him, especially with such hypocrisy. And then to see Peter, he was going to make use of those swords, those two swords that they had among them. But as we see, the Lord stopped him from proceeding any further. And he healed the man with the ear cut off. You just wonder whatever happened to that man. He must have thought a lot about that. Ear being cut off and healed by the Lord. Undoubtedly, I think he must have come to the Lord sometime in the future. And then we go on to the next passage. Peter denies Jesus and weeps bitterly. Verse 54. Then having arrested him, they led him and brought him into the high priest's house. But Peter followed at a distance. Now when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them. And a certain servant girl, seeing him as he sat by the fire, looked intently at him and said, "This man was also with him." But he denied him, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." And after a little while another saw him and said, "You also are of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." Then after about an hour had passed, another confidently affirmed, saying, "Surely this fellow also was with him, for he is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are saying." And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." Then Peter went out and wept bitterly. You know, it was a terrible thing to face the possibility of the cross. And I'm sure that's what scared Peter half to death. And scared him into doing something he would never have thought he could possibly do. And he was undoubtedly very, very honest when he told the Lord he would never deny him. But faced with the possibility of the cross, he was a completely different man. And he saw himself in a new light that night. Peter had some self-revelation of his own weakness. And undoubtedly that, being a man who had such unbounded self-confidence, undoubtedly he made a great step forward spiritually that night. Certainly this was something he could never forget. Then verse 63 says, "Now the men who held Jesus mocked him and beat him, and having blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, 'Prophesy, who is it that struck you?' And many other things they blasphemously spoke against him." Undoubtedly, we don't have any idea of how much of a beating the Lord took that night. Isaiah, of course, gives us a little glimpse of it. In Isaiah 52, it says in verse 13, "Behold, my servant shall deal prudently, he shall be exalted and extolled and be very high. Just as many were astonished at you, so his visage was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men." Now that's a drastic statement. Many were astonished at you, so his visage was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. Some people actually take that to mean that he was hardly recognized as a human being. He was so beat up, and so his face was so marred. But in any case, we know that he took a terrible beating that night, and these rough Roman soldiers enjoyed beating people up. That was their specialty, and they were very good at it. And the last part of the passage says, "As soon as it was day, the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, came together and led him into their council, saying, 'If you are the Christ, tell us.' But he said to them, 'If I tell you, you will by no means believe. And if I also ask you, you will by no means answer me or let me go. Hereafter the Son of Man will sit on the right hand of the power of God.' Then they all said, 'Are you the Son of God?' And he said to them, 'You rightly say that I am.' And they said, 'What further testimony do we need? For we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth.'" Of course, he referred here to the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 7. Daniel says in verse 9, "I watched till thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was as white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. I watched then because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking. I watched till the beast was slain, and its body destroyed and given to the burning flame. As for the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time." Now listen to this. "I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed." So it became very well known. This is such a clear, tremendous passage that it became very well known among the people of Israel that this Son of Man is spoken of here, one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. And he came to the Ancient of Days. It's a very important passage on the Trinity, at least the Father and the Son. Ancient of Days would be the Father, and the Son of Man would be the Son. And they brought him near before him. Then to him, that is to the Son of Man, was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one that shall not be destroyed. That's very clear. And so when the Lord said, hereafter the Son of Man will sit on the right hand of the power of God, immediately everybody knew what he was talking about. And so he very clearly confesses that he's the Messiah. Notice verse 70, then they all said, are you then the Son of God? And he said to them, you rightly say that I am. By the way, they believed in the Son of God too. And so the Lord, remember the Apostles' Creed speaks of the testimony of the Lord before Pontius Pilate, and undoubtedly before this group too. He clearly testified that he was the Son of Man, he was the Messiah that is to come. Well, that brings us to the end of the chapter. I feel I've done a very poor job of covering this chapter, but it will have to do for now at least.